Activist Riz Posnet disrupted a speech by gender-critical feminist Kathleen Stock to the Oxford Union Debating Society earlier this week. Wearing a T-shirt which read, "No more dead trans kids," Posnet glued herself to the floor before being removed by police. Posnet has been praised in many quarters for her stunt, and she said, quote, "I respect Kathleen's right to free speech, but I'm also painfully aware of the consequences of her anti-trans propaganda. Her career and image is built around misinformation and fear-mongering. The consequences of Stock's message and the broader media hate campaign are extensive. Trans people in the UK are stigmatised, threatened and harassed." Ella Whelan, journalist, author of What Women Want, joins me now. Welcome to the show. Ella, I just read that statement by the activist Riz Posnet. First thing to say is it all seems factually incorrect.
Yes, I mean, well, it's outrageous to suggest that there is a direct link between Kathleen Stock making arguments or writing books about women's rights, gender issues, or even anything to do with trans rights or trans people, that there would be a direct link between that and the death of trans people, as she was suggesting. That's completely outrageous and untrue. I think Kathleen Stock is blue in the face, saying that actually most of the time she doesn't talk about trans people, she's talking about women, and so there's a kind of horrible irony in that. But also there is this sort of slightly humorous kind of suggestion that in one of the parts of her statement is that Kathleen Stock's comments are linked to waiting times and gender reaffirming surgery or treatment, which is, I mean, that's slightly letting the NHS off the hook, but there's a kind of...
Yes, I mean, it seems very histrionic. And, you know, the thing about that is she also says that she's anti-trans rights and this kind... That's factually wrong as well. I mean, Kathleen Stock has repeatedly asserted the importance for trans people to have equal rights as everyone else.
Yes, and it kind of gets irritating having to constantly reiterate that as a woman, because you who's trying to talk about women's spaces. I'm sure it must take off Kathleen Stock, who's asked to talk about this all the time. But I think you have to kind of take a step back and say, are we meant to seriously engage? The minute I saw the T-shirt,
yes,
I thought, I'm not going to be seriously engaging with this person, because if you are, in actual fact, weaponising death or suicide or whatever it is that you're suggesting trans people are dying of in order to shut down a speaker, then for me you've already lost the argument.
But that happens again and again with activists sort of saying to parents of children who might have are struggling with their gender identity that all of a sudden they're told, unless you put these kids on puberty blockers, they will kill themselves. What would you prefer, a dead kid or a kid on medication? Which
is incredibly irresponsible, because if we are to believe the sort of, you know, the kind of panic that we've got at the moment about young people accessing social media, particularly vulnerable young people who might be feeling messed up about their identity. And if you're one of those young people and you look and you see the argument that if you don't get the pills you want or the therapy you want or wherever it is, that you are likely to kill yourself, then, you know, as a suggestible, vulnerable young person, that's not a message you should be seeing. So it's almost like we're kind of speaking into action what we don't want to happen by creating this kind of, you know, histrionic response around the idea that we would have a debate about, you know, things that are pretty normal, like whether or not who you would allow into a prison, who you would allow into a changing room, things like that shouldn't be the cause of someone taking their own life.
Now, part of the problem, of course, is that activists refuse to discuss. Stonewall's mantra for so long was no debate. But that's why this is fundamental misunderstanding. On the one hand, you've got activists for whom the idea of male and female, man and woman, these are identity categories. And then you've got feminists for whom, or not just feminists, but 99% of human beings, for whom male and female are biological classifications, biological categories. How can a discussion even happen when two people have completely different definitions?
I'm starting to think it's a little bit like, and it's going to sound harsh to people of faith here, but I'm starting to think it's a little bit like when you try to have a row with someone who believes in God when you don't believe in God. There's only so far you can get until you have to both say, OK, and now we've met our limit because I've cannot get on board with what you're saying. And I think the kind of, you know, the trans rights activists kind of gender ideology has gotten to that point where it is a kind of new religion where there is just either you believe it or you don't.
Yes.
And as you said, a lot of it isn't based in reality. But the interesting thing about the no debate stuff is that in response to Riz's protest, there were lots of people, a lot of irritating academics as it happens, piling in and saying, but this is free speech. Come on, you free speech warriors. This is free speech. She should be allowed to stay there. Kathleen Stock can do her talk and Riz stays there. And, that's a free society, which is just ridiculous. I mean, speaking as someone who organises the Battle of Ideas Festival, I know what happens when you run an event. And you're not, if you're not allowed, you're not meant to be okay with someone just coming in, sitting on the table or on the floor in front of you and messing up your whole event. That's not protest. It's a really infantile way of looking at what protest actually means. And anyone who's done a stunt like that knows you do it, you go in, you try and make as much noise, song and dance, and then you get moved on, and you understand that you are going to get moved on. Because the interesting thing about this trans argument is that they say there is no debate, and any kind of good protest is actually a debate, because what you're meant to be doing on a sort of successful political protest is winning people to your cause. And unfortunately, I think a bit kind of like Extinction Rebellion, those kind of protesters, a lot of these trans right activists don't want to convince the general public about their point of view. They just want to throw their toys out of the pram.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? There's one thing protesting against something which I'm sure we would both support, but it's another thing to disrupt so that other people can't hear. You've even had protesters punching gender-critical feminists in the face to try and get them resorting to violence. Yeah. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of what a liberal society is meant to be, right?
Yeah, no, assault isn't protest.
Right.
But on the other hand, protest is supposed to be disruptive. I've done lots of things myself throughout my university career where you went in and just obnoxious things like started clapping really loudly and things like that. Yeah. But you understood that you then got moved on. Yeah. Nobody sat in the middle of the floor and said, how dare you? I have a right to be here. Because we weren't, thankfully at least, I mean, even in this scenario, we weren't so narcissistic as thinking that the world... I think this is a real problem with the current approach to protest, related to the eco stuff, but also this, is that there is just this sense of I am the centre of the universe and what's going on around me doesn't matter. When in actual fact, to reiterate the point, any kind of good protest or any kind of good stunt interacts with the world around you. And so, this isn't your sitting room. You're not allowed to just stay here. You're going to get kicked out.
Well, it feels authoritarian because, tyrants don't debate. They say no debate, do what I say. And that's what these people are doing, right? Yeah,
they're saying that the very presence of a debate, that Kathleen Stock's literal physical bodily presence in a room is threatening to them. Actually, if you go back to that documentary that detailed the talk that she gave at Cambridge University, where she was at the debating society, and she said, I'm not even meant to be here to talk about gender ideology. Actually, it was about sort of offence and free speech and more general things. But the very fact that this witch, as they see her, was on campus meant that they all lost their minds. I mean, maybe she does have supernatural powers. I don't know, because she seems to make a lot of people lose it. But not for the kind of, they don't engage with the ideas that she has. I think that's a terrible shame.
Ella Whelan, thanks very much for joining me.